I want you to picture two plates. Plate number one, we've got some leafy greens, colorful vegetables, some berries, maybe some walnuts on top, right? And a drizzle of olive oil. And this takes up half of your plate. Okay? On the other half, there's a beautiful piece of salmon and some brown rice and quinoa. Okay? And then there's a big glass of water. Plate number two, you've got a big juicy steak, a baked potato with a pat of butter melting on top, some broccoli and carrots, and a glass of whole milk. Okay, both of these plates reflect official government dietary recommendations, current recommendations. One of them could come from a number of countries: Canada, Sweden, Germany, China, the Netherlands, India, okay? They all basically agree. The other one comes from just one country, and it's a country that looked at the same nutrition science, right? The same research, and wound up recommending a very different plate. So which country? And more importantly, why? Right? That's the mystery we're solving today. And I'm going to warn you, the answer involves a 400-page report that got set aside, industry money, influencers, and a food pyramid that hasn't existed for 15 years, suddenly making a comeback. So let's get into it. Welcome to Happy and Healthy with Amy, the brain health podcast for women in midlife who want to not just survive, but actually thrive during the menopause transition and beyond. I'm Amy Lang, master health coach, best-selling author, and daughter of Alzheimer's, and I'm here to help you make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. Well, hi there, Amy here. Thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome back to another episode of Happy and Healthy with Amy. So this is part 3 of our series on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, DGA for short. Okay, so in parts 1 and 2, we covered a lot. What the guidelines got right, the missed opportunity on fiber, the contradictions, the culture wars, and the alcohol double standard. Today, we're zooming out, okay? We're going global. So I'm going to take you on a tour around the world. And I think it's going to be very enlightening and maybe even surprising for some of you folks. But before we get into it, we really need to talk about the new food pyramid. So there's an expression, I'm sure you've heard of it, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So when the new Dietary Guidelines for Americans dropped on January 7th, 2026, it spoke volumes. Now, if you haven't seen it yet, it's an upside down food pyramid, a triangle, right? With the label protein, dairy, and healthy fats prominently at the top left. It includes a big raw steak, a block of cheese, what looks like some hamburger meat, a whole roasted chicken or turkey, not sure which one, okay, a sunny side up egg, a carton of whole milk, some yogurt, some olive oil, there's shrimp, canned tuna, a walnut, and a few peanuts. And then there's a stick of butter in the middle. Okay, at the top right, there's a label, vegetables and fruit. And here you've got broccoli, tomato, there's a bag of frozen peas, leafy greens of some sort. Okay, you've got a potato, an apple, some strawberries, blueberries, bananas, red grapes, and an avocado. And these two sections take up about the same amount of space. Okay, and then the label for whole grains is at the bottom of this triangle or pyramid. Okay, and it's the smallest section. Takes up maybe 1/10 of the overall area. And in this section, there's a bowl of, I'm guessing, oatmeal and some loose kernels of, I'm not sure what, maybe oats or barley. So here in the US, we read from left to right. So protein, dairy, and healthy fats are seen first, right? And then you've got vegetables and fruit, and finally whole grains at the bottom. And the top line message at the press conference was eat real food, avoid ultra-processed foods, and prioritize protein at every meal. Okay. Also, RFK Jr. said, we're ending the war on saturated fat. So clearly, there's an emphasis on animal protein, right? Especially red meat. And there's also a prioritization of animal-based protein sources, right? Including dairy, instead of a plant-forward or plant-predominant dietary pattern. In other words, you didn't see any soybeans or tofu or lentils or chickpeas or quinoa shown in the graphic, right? Nothing prominent. Now, when you go to the official website for the DGAs, it actually shows the old food pyramid from 1992. So they're really pushing this narrative that they fixed the food pyramid. But here's what you might not know. Okay, first, that old food pyramid that they have on the website was replaced by My Plate in 2011. That's 15 years ago. Okay, so when they unveiled this new pyramid, it wasn't a flip of existing guidance, right? It was bringing back a format that had been retired because the science and communication both have evolved, right? Second, when you compare the visual and compare it to the written guidelines, okay, the DGAs, the written guidelines, still say to limit saturated fat to less than 10% of your daily calories. And this recommendation hasn't changed since 1990. And finally, on top of all of this, we've got the suggestion that butter and beef tallow, which is basically rendered beef fat, are healthy cooking options. And then there's the recommendation of 3 servings of full-fat dairy every day, which when you do the math, right, when you actually do the math, is impossible if you follow what's depicted in the new food pyramid, with all the emphasis on animal proteins. Okay, so how did we get here? Well, let me just give you a quick recap of what happened. There were 20 world-renowned nutrition scientists who went through extensive background checks on financial, ethical, legal, and even criminal conflicts of interest, who also had ethics training yearly. Okay, they volunteered, as in they donated their time to review the latest research. And their committee meetings were also live streamed for the public. So they spent 2 years reviewing the evidence, which then culminated in a 400-page report that they submitted in December 2024. Okay, that report was actually set aside, and the final guidelines leaned on reviews conducted by experts chosen via a federal contracting process. Okay, now, of the 9 people involved in this new group, Okay, so we went from 20 to 9. At least 7 of them had financial ties to beef, pork, and dairy industries, among other companies like Infant Formula and Simply Good Foods, which owns Atkins and Quest Nutrition, right? These are brands that sell low-carb food products. Now keep in mind, while a lot of people aren't directly affected by these guidelines, right? If you choose what you buy and what you eat, there are a number of federal nutrition programs that follow these guidelines, right? They set policy, including the National School Lunch Program, SNAP, WIC, and the military. And when these guidelines were released, here's what Michael Dykes, who's the CEO of the International Dairy Foods Association, actually said. The new dietary guidelines send a clear and powerful message to Americans. Dairy foods belong at the center of a healthy diet. Of course, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association also welcomed the new guidelines. Of course they did, right? Meanwhile, there's a Harvard professor who served on the DGAC, again, this is the original committee, who described the process as going from, and I quote, the most transparent I've ever been part of to the most opaque thing I've ever seen. So let me ask you, when the industries that benefit from the guidelines are celebrating, and the scientists who did the actual research, who reviewed this research, are concerned, what does that tell you? Right? This is not a rhetorical question, okay? I'd really love to know what you think. So please share your thoughts in the comments or send me an email or message me on social media. Okay? So that's the backdrop. Now let's look at what the rest of the world is doing. So I saw an Instagram carousel earlier this week by Dr. Akesh Patel. Okay? He compared dietary guidelines from different countries in Europe and Canada, and he noted, and I quote, the U.S. represents a stark outlier. So why did he say that? Well, let's go on that world tour I promised. Okay, we're going to start with Europe. These are some of the healthiest populations in the world. And several of the countries just updated their guidelines in 2024 and 2025. Okay, so really current. So if there were new science supporting more butter and beef tallow, you'd expect to see it here, right? Now, here's what they actually say. And I'm just highlighting here, okay? Sweden in 2025. Fish, beans, peas, and lentils, often. Red meat and processed meat, now and then. Germany in 2024. Increase plant-based foods, lower animal-based foods. The Netherlands, 2025. Less meat and more legumes and nuts. Finland, 2024. Plant-forward diets for human and planetary health. Norway in 2024. Choose mostly plant-based foods. Use vegetable oils. Switzerland in 2024. Vegetable oils are preferable. So every single one is moving more plant-forward, right? More legumes. Vegetable oils over butter. Meat as an occasional food, not the centerpiece. Okay, and then there's Canada. In 2019, they removed dairy as a separate food group entirely. So their plate is half vegetables and fruits, with plant proteins featured prominently. Okay, and then water as the drink of choice. So there's no butter in sight. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, like, well, that's Europe and Canada, right? They've got their own politics and climate activists and vegan enthusiasts, right? They're socialists. Okay, fair enough. I actually thought some of the same things. So I decided to take a look at 2 other countries that are definitely not influenced by Western progressive politics, right? Or big meat, or the carnivore vegan culture war that's here in the US. So first, China. So China's food guide Pagoda, right? That's their version of our pyramid, has grains and vegetables at the base, the largest section. Oils and fats at the top, right? Use sparingly. They also recommend 120 to 200 grams of animal protein per day, okay, not per meal. And on alcohol, the guidance says avoid, not consume less, okay? Avoid. So this is the Chinese government. Not exactly known for caving to Western anything, right? Second, we've got India. So India's guidelines say very less use of ghee, butter, and vanaspati. Very less use. And as you probably know, India has a lot of vegetarians, right? So the guidelines also explicitly state that vegetarians can get all necessary nutrients from plant-based diets. So India has 1.4 billion people. China also has 1.4 billion people. So that's 2.8 billion people getting dietary guidelines that look nothing like the new U.S. pyramid. So when I say the U.S. is the odd one out, right, I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not exaggerating. And this isn't a left-right thing, right? This isn't a Western thing. This is literally the entire world trending in one direction and the U.S. going in the other, right? And I challenge anyone to find another developed country whose official dietary guidelines say butter or beef tallow as recommended cooking fats, right? 3 servings of full-fat dairy daily. And proteins and fats as the visual emphasis over plants. You won't be able to find one. And for anyone who thinks we're ahead of other countries or leading the way to a brave new world, I'd love to chat. I really would, okay? Let's look at the evidence and show me what I'm missing. Now, what does it look like when science actually drives the guidelines? Well, I personally think Canada nailed it. So in 2019, they released a completely redesigned food guide. And they made some really bold choices. So first, again, they removed dairy as a separate food group, right? They included it with protein. Now, the dairy industry there argued that there is, quote, abundant research that dairy with various fat levels can fit in a healthy diet. But again, dairy wasn't excluded. It wasn't ditched. It was simply put under the protein category. Unlike the written DGA guidelines, right? Again, the dietary guidelines for Americans that actually still have consumed dairy as its own category call-out, with the same emphasis as protein and vegetables. Okay. Second, their visual is a plate with real food. So it's not an abstract pyramid, an actual plate. So it's definitely my favorite visual. Okay, so what's the visual? Half the plate, you've got vegetables and fruit, right? 1/4 protein with some salmon and then some plant proteins, again featured prominently, and then 1/4 whole grains. And there's a glass of water on the side, not milk. Okay, and then third, this is important, the visual matches the written guidance. So there's no contradictions, right? What you see is what they recommend. And fourth and finally, they explicitly excluded the food industry from the advisory process. Okay? And the result? The Canadian guidelines align with not only the global consensus, but also with the MIND diet for brain health. Okay, so what does all of this mean for you? Well, the MIND diet, right, the eating pattern that's been shown to reduce Alzheimer's risk by up to 53%, looks like Canada's plate. Plate number 1 that I described at the very beginning of this episode. So for those of you who care about brain health, and that's probably why you're here, right? There's a clear path forward, right? There's no need for confusion. And if you haven't grabbed it yet, I've got a wallet-sized version of the MIND Diet food chart that you can print out and carry with you. Okay, so just go to moxie-club.com/wallet, or the QR code will take you there, right? So you can get it. Okay, so here's what the MIND diet emphasizes as brain healthy food groups and what you'll see on the food chart. So there are green leafy vegetables. We're talking, the goal here is to have 6 or more servings per week. Okay, so we're talking vegetables like kale, arugula, spinach, and bok choy. Okay, so these are loaded with antioxidants, which combats oxidative stress, and they're also a little higher in fiber than most of the other vegetables out there. Now, other vegetables, we want colorful, and we want at least 1 serving a day. Then we've got berries. So you want to eat a serving of berries. So think strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, and raspberries at least twice a week. Okay? Again, these are high in fiber, and they also tend to be high in antioxidants. Then we've got whole grains. So you want to try to get at least 3 servings a day of whole grains like quinoa and oatmeal. So think whole grains instead of full fat dairy. Okay? Fish, at least 1 serving per week, and not fried. Nuts, the goal is to eat 5 or more servings of nuts a week. So we're talking almonds, walnuts, pecans, pistachios, cashews, okay? And then beans and legumes. You want to aim for 4 or more servings of beans a week. So this includes options like black beans, lentils, pinto beans, kidney beans, soybeans, okay? And then poultry, aim for eating a serving of poultry at least twice a week, okay? And then choose extra virgin olive oil as your go-to cooking oil, okay? Rather than other types of oil that are saturated fat, like butter or beef tallow or margarine, okay? And then what to avoid, or at least be mindful of? Well, first, red meat. So shoot for less than 4 servings a week of red meat. Okay, so this includes beef, pork, lamb, or products made from these meats. Okay, less than 1 tablespoon of butter per day. And then with pastries and sweets, we want to shoot for less than 5 servings a week. When it comes to cheese, less than 1 serving a week for cheese. And then fried or fast food, again, less than 1 serving a week. Okay, so does this sound like the new U.S. pyramid with butter and steak at the top and 3 servings of full-fat dairy? No, right? It sounds like Canada's food guide. It sounds like what the DGAC actually recommended. So, don't wait for U.S. policy to change, okay? You have the information you need right now, okay? I want you to use Canada's plate as your box top. So remember that analogy from part 1 that I used, the picture of the puzzle box that shows you what you're working toward, okay? Half your plate, vegetables and fruits, right? Make sure you include leafy greens. And then 1/4 protein, and that includes beans, lentils, tofu, fish, as well as poultry. And then 1/4 whole grains with water as your primary drink. Okay, and then we're really looking for more healthy fats, as in mono and polyunsaturated fats. So for cooking, we're talking olive oil. Okay, that's your box top. That's what the science supports. And then as a health coach, I want to remind you, you don't have to be perfect. Okay, we are not going for perfection. We're going for one better choice at a time. Okay, so if you'd like to put what you learned in this episode into action, here's what I'd recommend. Number 1, look up Canada's food guide. So, of course, I've included a link in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the description, right? So I've included a link to the plate. I want you to screenshot it, or better yet, print it out and put it on your fridge. Okay, let that be your visual reference. Number 2, think about your protein sources and your fiber sources. So this week, how about trying one meal where your protein comes from plants, like beans or lentils, right? You could even try a meatless Monday, where it's all the meals for one day. Because again, the research has consistently shown that plant proteins, especially when you eat a variety of plants, are just as good for you and lower in saturated fat. And they're also a great source of fiber, which most of us don't get enough of, right? Plus, beans and lentils are actually less expensive than meat. So this is also a budget-friendly option. Okay? Number 3, share this episode. So if you found this helpful, please share it with someone who's confused about the new guidelines or who's concerned about their brain health. Right? And if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Let's really push this video out to more people. Actually, if you've made it this far, you've done your job, okay? So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening and for watching. It truly means the world to me. Truly. Okay? The algorithm also knows. So, to recap the key takeaways of this series. Yes, eat real food. Yes, avoid ultra-processed foods that contain a lot of refined carbohydrates and preservatives and other additives, right? And if you want to prioritize protein at every meal, that's fine, okay? Just make sure you're including plant-based proteins like soybeans and lentils and legumes and quinoa, okay? As well as fish like salmon that have essential fatty acids that they called out in the guidelines, in the DGAs, okay? And if you really want to follow the science, I'd say prioritize plants and fiber and use Canada's food guide, which shows real food on a real plate. And it also aligns with the Mind Diet for brain health. Okay, so again, use that guide and not the upside down food pyramid. Right? So to wrap things up today, I want to leave you with a quote by Anne Wigmore. The food you eat can be either the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison.